Yesterday, if you grew up in Cecilia's family, you would have been celebrating the Feast of Tres Reyes, correct?
Yes, it's fantastic.
What warm desert were you in?
The heat was really high in my house.
One of those crazy quirks in the liturgical calendar. January 6th, Feast of the Epiphany, one of the great feasts of the church year. And the first Sunday after Epiphany, which marks the end of the Christmas season, which just this year happens to be 24 hours later, we focus not on a child, but on an adult who begins a very public life with a very public symbol. Being washed, being prayed over, and identifying with us. And when people talk about baptism as a kid, when I think of baptisms and I think of all the children I have baptized over the course of my many decades as a priest, there are those moments that kind of strike you, even in terms of preparation. And I don't want to embarrass you guys. I didn't know you were going to be from college. But you are a part of a story that I will proclaim for the rest of my years in active ministry. And that is I will remember the summer day that after having spoken with Jen and specifically and Jim, I asked to speak with Riley and Georgia themselves. You were, in the summer of your freshman year, you were going into 8th grade, okay? You probably don't even remember the conversation in my office. And I kind of asked you, all right, you want to be baptized. Why? Why are you doing this? Do you remember that at all? Okay. And it wasn't an interrogation. It wasn't the third degree. That wasn't what it was about. But it was to make a point with two young people that unlike a child who was brought to church because of the faith commitment that a parent is willing to make, they had reached the stage in life where it had to be their choice. Just like you guys, in renewing your baptismal vows on the day you're confirmed, 3 of you here today, how many times have I told you? This must be your choice. The only voice that must be heard at that moment is yours. I don't want to get us all bogged down in theological debates. I will tell you that part of the more boring parts of preparing for priesthood, you read, not pages, inches of pages of text of great theologians who have debated over the centuries why Jesus bothered to be baptized. What was the point? Okay, if he truly is who we believe him to be, Son of God, and if this movement that John began, if this gesture was for the forgiveness of sins, God does not need forgiveness, and who does God forget for forgiveness if not himself? What's the whole point of it? Did Jesus need to be baptized? No. Do we need to have him do this for us? Very much so. Which gets us to take one Sunday a year, one day a year, and kind of reflect on the meaning of how important baptism is for us and our journey. Why we're here sitting in a not so warm church, which is slightly warmer than what's out there, or what's in your homes. These guys haven't heard this yet, and I'm sure you guys remember this because you remember everything we talked about in that class over that year, of course, 5 years ago. Don't suck up to me, Riley. You know you did. But you probably... Remember I told you when eyes walk into a church, there's supposed to be 4 things we're supposed to immediately focus on. George, you're shaking your head. You remember any of them?
The font.
The font, very good. Remember the other 3? Okay, but very good. Now, the font, the pulpit, the chair, the table. Okay? The 4, and you're going to hear this in about a couple of weeks. All right? Walk into a church building where you worship. The most important things we do in this building, we enter into this church. We are made members of this community, the community of the Jesus movement, to use the words of our presiding bishop. And we are fed by God's word, instructed in that word, and fed at God's table. And that's what's supposed to happen week after week after week. That's what makes us Christians. But why is coming into this room and why passing that font should be so important? It should remind us of a couple of things that Jesus identified with, and this is about our journey as well. First of all, for whatever baptism meant for Jesus, why he chose to do this for himself, it was a moment of decision. For years, living in obscurity, living around the area of Nazareth, probably working as a woodworker, probably working in the area around Sepphoris, which was the closest major city that we now know about, And he's looking for some sort of sign to begin his ministry, to begin his active work. And John coming out of the desert was that sign. And I've used this as an image before. John, who, as Scripture tells us, dressed out of place, out of style. He kind of dressed like the prophet Elijah hundreds of years ago, and it's like I've used with Kathy as an example. If I started talking right one and dressing like a Tudor Elizabethan, that's what John would have been perceived by his own people, kind of a person out of his own time. And Jesus used the appearance of this person as a moment to make a decision. This is the moment where now I start doing whatever my Father wants me to do. And the day we were baptized, whether you had the decision made for you by your parent or godparent, or if you were like George and Riley, who had to make that decision for themselves, that was the day your life changed. Because that was the day you became an adopted child of God. That was the day you were anointed with God's Spirit. And the very life of God flows within you. And our lives are not aimless, they are not tragic, they are not wasted. Because you are the living symbol of God in our dark world. And not only was it a moment of decision, it's a moment of identification. As Jesus identified with us, we identify with him. Now we're part of his movement. We live his word, we listen to his good news, and we take that into our world. Not speaking for ourselves, but for him. For Jesus, it was also a moment of approval. And the day you were baptized is the day God spoke and said, this is someone who is my child, my son, my daughter. In you I am well pleased. And Mark writes magnificently. He uses a phrase that he will only once again use in the entire telling of the story of Jesus. He says, when Jesus comes out of the water, there was a moment where earth and heaven kind of was united, and the division between the two breaks away. And he uses this phrase, the heavens were torn apart. And Jesus hears a voice saying, I approve of what you're about to do. And that phrase, the heavens were torn apart, and I don't care how it's translated in modern English, that's what the phrase is as it was written. Torn apart. He will use that phrase only one other time. When Jesus dies, and the veil of the curtain is torn apart as a public symbol. And Mark is saying, yes, at that moment also, the division between the divine and the human is broken for that moment. And God approves of what has done. So I'm going to ask you this morning in a couple of minutes to renew the vows of your own baptism, speaking as a community. In a couple of weeks, probably 12 weeks from now, 3 of you in this room are going to renew your vows very privately, speaking only for yourself. Realize that this is a moment of empowerment. It is a moment where God chooses you and you say in response to that choice, I will, I do. Part of this movement means we're not lost, we're not wandering, we're not without meaning. God's Spirit really descended upon us. And waters that are life-giving and dangerous and nourishing and threatening have flowed over you. And by your baptism, you are marked as Christ's own forever. You are marked and sealed with his Spirit forever. That's who we are. And that is what the Lord calls us to be. So as you leave here today, in grace, may that God continue to walk with you and you be aware of that. You don't walk alone. And secondly, in strength, may you leave from here as a person in his service, remembering what God has called you to be, what you have decided to be, what he has chosen you to be. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.